The Republic of the Philippines is a nation made up of over 7,000 islands, nestled in the western Pacific Ocean. In 1981, it was home to nearly 50 million people. In 1981, Ferdinand Marcos had been president for the past 17 years and held the country under martial law for the past 9 of those years. Amidst a financial crisis, Marcos' rule looked to be tenuous as political opposition began to spring up from all directions. The people wanted change, and militant communist organizations were waiting in the wings to steer the country towards their own ideologies. This is the insurgency in the Philippines, 1981 to 1986. This is People Power from GMT Games, and you're watching What Does That Piece Do? People Power is a battle between 3 factions. The government, which is trying to maintain control and keep their patronage high. The militant NPA, who are spreading terror and inciting strikes as they build bases and shift the map spaces to resistance. And the non-violent reformers, who are also building bases while trying to leverage protests, which will shift the map to opposition. Each faction has a unique set of actions they can perform, or they can choose to activate an event from the event cards in the deck that controls the flow of the game. Players don't take these cards into their hands, there's always just one exposed at a time, and it drives the game. There are some other cards that you may add to the game for a bit more complexity and excitement. These are the personalities and acts of desperation cards, which are new elements to the coin system, which I'll touch on briefly throughout the video. There are a total of 4 election cards, 2 or 3 of which will be spread throughout the deck. As election cards are revealed, the game will pause. Players will check if anyone has met their victory condition, and if not, then every faction can shore up some extra resources and potentially take a few actions before a reset takes place, and then proceed with play, drawing one more event card until the next election card comes up. Those election cards stay in place for the following round, and they'll have lasting effects. I'll get into the event and election cards in a bit. I just mentioned this here to point out that the game isn't over as soon as a player meets the threshold for their victory condition. The game can only possibly end when an election card is revealed and a player has reached that victory condition. Or if it's the last election of the game, the player who has exceeded or is closest to their victory condition will be the winner. You'll see shortly the importance of control over the spaces, how they shift between support, opposition, and resistance, and which factions benefit from these various states. For now, know that those things are tracked along the left side and up towards the top of the board, among other things like the number of resources each faction has with these round cylinders. Note also that the factions are aiming for different quantitative levels of their specific victory condition. So for government, they're aiming for control plus patronage to be over 18. NPA is looking for resistance plus their number of bases on the map to be over 13, and the reformers want to get their opposition and their bases over 12. Each faction has a certain number and type of pieces that are placed and moved around on the map that will help them achieve their victory conditions and thwart the other players from reaching theirs. Government has these cubes which represent troops and police, and these discs are government bases. These cubes all serve different roles to maintain order. Both can be deployed to the map in the same fashion, but police are most effective in cities, troops more so in the countryside. The MPA has these guerrillas, which are the octo cylinders here, and a bunch of bases. You'll notice the guerrillas have a blank side, which is underground, thus they're hidden to government troops, and the active side has their symbol of a fist, which means they're exposed to government operations. Guerrillas become active throughout play, and in some cases that faction will need underground guerrillas to even execute certain actions. The reformers have these cylinder pieces, which are their activists. Much like the guerrillas, they're only active when flipped to show their El Laban hand symbol. Yes, that's right, active activist is a concept you'll need to wrap your brain around for this game, and for Gandhi if you ever get to play that, so it's not a singular conundrum for just this one game in the coin series. Anyway, there will only ever be active activists when they are in a protest space, so more on that later. All of these wooden bits are pieces, which is important to call out as some events and actions can be taken by the player may refer to the pieces, which includes every bit here representing people and bases. But otherwise, the instructions will be very specific to say cubes, if that means any government piece but not a base, just referring to police and troops, or guerrillas, meaning the NPA pieces, or activists referring to the reformer pieces. There are these chits for terror, which you'll use only 10 in total in the game, and double-sided strike protest markers, of which only 4 will be used. The rest are spares. You can tuck them back in the box for now. As mentioned, all pieces are meant to be placed on the map, and if they're not on the map, then they're in the respective players' available boxes. The map of the Philippines has specific areas for cities and countryside spaces. Each space has a pair of boxes, one which indicates whether the space is at support for the government, resistance for the NPA, opposition for the reformers, or whether the space is simply neutral. The other box indicates whether the government or NPA have control of the space. Note that the reformers never mark their control, but they can nullify the other faction's control. So all cities and provinces have a population number, value of 1, 2, or 5 if it's the capital Manila. Those are multipliers for control, resistance, and opposition that contribute to the faction's victory conditions. So with that said, let's talk about control first. Certain actions and the government's overall victory condition are determined by individual control of the cities and provinces on the map. Control is determined by the faction that has the most pieces total in the space that's greater than the combined other pieces in that space, even if it's from the 2 other factions. However, reformer activists only count towards control if they're active. An empty space, therefore, is uncontrolled. But let's say this lone NPA guerrilla pops up in central Mindanao. That space is now under NPA control. If a reformer activist ends up being recruited in that space, central Mindanao would still be under NPA control. But if a protest pops up, that activist is active. So now the NPA control goes away. Again, reformers never have their control noted in the space, they just take it away. If there was a reformer base there instead, that piece counts towards control. And by the way, those will always count towards control. They don't have an active or inactive state. But now if there's 3 guerrillas up against 1 active reformer and 1 reformer base, NPA then has control again. But say now if the government sends in enough cubes equal to more than the other factions combined, government has control, and that space's population counts as points towards their victory condition. Thus, if government took control of eastern Mindanao, that would get them an extra 2 points on the victory track, since it's a population value of 2. As mentioned, some operations and special activities may only be executed depending on the control or lack thereof in a space. Those include the NPA's extort special activity, which can only be executed in spaces without government control, and certain elements of the government's train operation, as well as all 3 of their special activities. They must be in spaces with government control. And we'll get into operations and special activities shortly. Note that all cities and provinces has the same stacking limit, which is a maximum of 2 bases in a space, and that can be any combination of bases from the 3 factions, including 2 of the same faction. Now that we have control figured out, let's talk about support, resistance, and opposition. This is basically a 3-way matrix between these 3 states, and the 4th state just being neutral. In both scenarios that are outlined in the initial printing of the game, all spaces will start at either support or they'll be neutral. So NPA will want to shift those spaces to resistance, and reformers will want to shift them to opposition. Each shift changes the state of the space from one state to another 1 step at a time, with neutral potentially being one of those steps. If a space is at support and reformers want to move it to opposition, one shift will move it to neutral, and another shift will move it from neutral to opposition. Then if the NPA wants to shift that opposition space to resistance, that's 1 shift to neutral and another shift to resistance, and vice versa, back and forth in either direction between those 3 states. Each faction will be able to execute operations or special activities that will shift in their favor, but only 1 step. The exception is the reformer's canvas special activity, which says set the space to opposition, a clear distinction from the word shift. Anytime you see the word set on an event card, know that it's an immediate change to that state. Otherwise, the instructions will clearly say shift towards. The MPA is looking to shift as many spaces in total population as possible to resistance. The reformers are looking to do the same for opposition, as those are the points for their victory condition. Using Eastern Mindanao as an example again, the MPA getting that space to resistance will count as 2 points for them on the track, and it would count for 2 points for the reformers if they get it set to opposition. Central Mindanao would only count for 1 point for either, since its population value is just 1. Note that although government doesn't need support to get their points towards their victory, support is crucial for their special activity enriched, but it also blocks the other factions from being able to execute some of their operations or makes them less effective. Support, resistance, and opposition may be conditions to execute some of the event cards as well. Each faction will need to spend these generic resources to conduct most of their actions. MPA and Reformer actions will cost 1 resource per space where the action takes place, and they could spend multiple resources in one turn. Government actions cost 2 per space. MPA and Reformers have special activities that allow them to recoup and collect resources, and more can be collected based on the board state during the propaganda rounds and possibly through the event cards. And players can even pass when it's their turn. They'll gain 3 resources when the government player does it, or 1 resource when the NPA or Reformer player passes. So, we figured out the pieces, the map, the resources. What do the players do with all this stuff? Well, they take actions, which are either operations or special activities. More often than not, players will be able to execute a single operation. You won't be able to do different types of operations in the same turn in different spaces, but perhaps you can do that same operation in multiple spaces. And sometimes they can conduct a special activity to go with them, depending upon the sequence of play, which I'll cover shortly. But note that when you do conduct operations or special events, it's only once in each space, so you couldn't pull the same move multiple times in one space in one turn. Got it? Good. Everything is covered with all the info you need in these player aids, so keep them nearby. I'll go through these operations and special activities fairly quickly to give you a sense of what can be done, without getting too detailed because these player aids should always be at your fingertips. And I'll use these pawns, which will help keep track of where players are making their moves. White ones are generally for operations, black ones for special activity, but use whichever you like as long as it's consistent and not confusing to other players. So let's start by looking at the government's operations. All government operations cost 2 resources. The first operation you'll see on the player aid list is train, which probably isn't by accident, since it's often the first thing government want to do. This allows them to get more of their pieces on the board, including bases, and it's a method to shift spaces to support. In any city and or in each countryside space that has a base, government can place up to 4 of their cubes. They can be troops or police. Then, in any one selected government-controlled space, that player can replace 3 cubes with a government base, or if that space has troops, police, and neither a protest or a strike marker, the government player may pay for what's called a civic action, which shifts the space towards support. That will cost 2 resources per shift, but that shift can't happen until any terror has been removed, which will also cost 2 resources. So say in Zamboanga, the government wanted to shift from resistance to support and remove the terror. That's 2 to remove the terror, 2 to shift to neutral, and 2 to shift to support, but also 2 to select the space to begin with. That'll be 8 resources in total. Note that the place base or civic action doesn't have to take place in the space where the cubes were added as part of the train operation. If it is an additional space, that will cost the additional 2 resources. At this point, I'll mention any pieces added to the board need to come from the player's available pieces, which are on their player mat. If there's not any pieces available, then they can be taken from anywhere on the board. That applies to all factions. Next up is Sweep, which is an operation that will reveal underground guerrillas and reposition the government cubes. Paying 2 resources per destination, government player may move any cubes to that destination as long as they're not already in a space with a protest or a strike marker. Then at that destination, flip over 1 underground guerrilla for every 2 troop cubes. Or if it's a city, 1 guerrilla per every 2 cubes total. If you're used to other coin games where cubes that are sweeping need to come from adjacent space, that's not a limitation in people power. These cubes can come from anywhere on the map. Note that you don't have to move any cubes into that space if you don't need to. You can do a sweep in place if the cubes are already there to expose those guerrillas. But now that guerrillas can't perform some of their crucial operations, and it leaves them subject to an assault, which we'll talk about soon. But first, let's cover another operation, Roundup. This is a way to remove active activists, yes, that term again, in any space with police and these active activists, which their Levan sign is facing up. Those police cubes may remove reformer pieces one for one. The activists must be removed before a reformer base is removed. That's a golden rule, by the way. Pieces of that faction representing people, activists or guerrillas, they always protect bases from removal by the normal operations. But note the drawback for the government if they take this operation. For every space where 2 reformer pieces are removed, active activists or bases, the government's aid goes down by 1. And aid, by the way, will affect their resource funding during the election phase. And now let's get back to Assault. The fourth and final operation you'll see on the government player list, that's the way to remove the active guerrillas. Remember, the guerrillas become active via the sweep operation, but they also might become active themselves through their own operations. But now if there's any active NPA pieces in spaces with cubes, government assault removes those pieces. 1 per troop when in the countryside or 1 per cube in cities. If NPA bases are removed that way, that's a +5 aid to the government. So to clarify, the government may sweep and reveal guerrillas, leaving them exposed to this assault operation at a later turn. But there's no way really to sweep and activate these reformer activists. They can only become exposed for a roundup by their own doing, which we'll look at next. Reformer operations. They all cost 1 resource, and to start, they can add more of their pieces on the board using an operation called Recruit. In any space that isn't at government support, they can add 1 inactive activist, that's the band sign down, or they can replace 2 activists with a base, or if there's already a reformer base, they can place activists equal to the number of bases plus the population of the space. So say there's 2 reformer bases in northern Luzon, that's a total of 4 activists placed in a single operation. As a reminder, only 2 bases per space of any faction color, but when placing reformer bases, be sure to adjust their score on the victory track, as that contributes to their victory condition. Next operation you'll see is Assemble. This will allow the reformer player to move any amount of activists from any adjacent spaces to a single space, costing 1 resource per destination. So they could have activists coming into Manila from northern and southern Luzon, and that would cost just 1 resource for that destination of Manila. Then, at any destination, they can remove terror. And on top of that, they can remove any protest from anywhere on the map. Doing this, as you'll see, would set any activists in those spaces back to inactive. The reformer player may use an operation called Persuade to remove guerrillas, whether those guerrillas are active or not. Costing 1 resource per space for every 3 activists, remove a guerrilla back to the NPA player's supply. And if there's a strike there, flip it over to Protest, and thus all those activists become active. And finally, Protest is the last operation you'll see for reformers. It's the crucial one. In any spaces with activists and no strike or terror markers, place the protest marker and shift that space 1 step towards opposition. Remember, you can only place a protest marker if there's one available. There's only 4 strike protest markers in the game. That said, you can also place one if there's already one there. Double down on protest, why not? If that space is set to opposition in this way, adjust the reformer's score accordingly, 1 point for each population that has now been set to opposition. And also, you don't need to have inactive activists in the space to do it. By placing protests in the space, that'll flip all activists in that space to active. So that's the golden rule. Any activists in a space with protests will be active, whether those specific pieces participated in placing the protest marker or not. If the protest is placed in a space by an event, or if the activists assemble to that destination as inactive from another space, they'll always be active in that final protest space. Likewise, if a protest is ever removed from a space for any reason, they'll flip back to inactive. Now let's talk about the NPA operations, which, like the reformer operations, they all cost 1 resource. Rally is a way for the NPA to get more guerrillas and NPA bases on the board. Much like the reformers Recruit, add 1 guerrilla in each space, or replace 2 guerrillas, underground or active, in a space with a base. or if there is a base, place guerrillas equal to the number of bases plus population, or they can flip all the guerrillas in that space to underground. Remember, when adding bases, adjust the score for the NPA player. March is a way to move the guerrillas. Paying 1 resource per origin space, unlike the Reformers' Assemble, which is per destination, that'll move any number of guerrillas to any adjacent spaces. Now, if that destination space is at support and moving guerrillas plus the number of cubes in that destination is greater than 3, activate all the moving guerrillas. For example, the NPA player has 3 underground guerrillas in southern Luzon. They can move all 3 to northern Luzon, even though there's 2 government cubes there, because the space currently isn't at support, so the guerrillas won't flip active. But moving any number of guerrillas to Manila, which is at support and full of cubes, that'll flip the guerrillas. Also note a rule specific to Cebu and Visayas. If those spaces are a destination, only 1 guerrilla can move in from each origin space. So in Cebu, that'll mean only 1 guerrilla marching into that at a time, since Visayas is the only adjacent space. But Visayas can receive guerrillas from southern Luzon, Cebu, and any of the Mindanao spaces all in one march. But it would cost 1 per origin space. Attack is NPA's way of removing government cubes from a space. Activate all guerrillas in that space. If there are any to activate, and that doesn't have to be, they can just be any number of guerrillas, that NPA player rolls a single die. If the number rolled is less than or equal to the number of attacking guerrillas, again, whether they were activated or not, then the NPA can remove 2 government pieces, starting with cubes first and bases last. If a 1 is rolled, they can place another underground guerrilla. Subtract 2 government patronage for each base removed this way. And finally, terror is a way for the NPA to shift a space towards resistance. In a space with an underground guerrilla, flip that guerrilla to active and place a terror marker. Then shift the space 1 step towards resistance. If the space shifts to resistance, adjust the NPA score accordingly based on that space's population value. Again, for this one, you definitely need an underground guerrilla to be able to execute it. So those are the operations. Sometimes factions may be able to pair those operations with special activities. So let's look at those quickly now. The government can enrich to gain patronage, which requires shifting a space that's under government control and at support to neutral. Then the government player adds twice the value of the population of that space to patronage and reduces the aid by 1. Note that this can't be done in Manila. That's a huge point swing, but note that with the space at neutral, that leaves it vulnerable to the other faction's activities. This can only be done in one space, pairs with any operation. In order to scare off opponents, set a space to neutral, and get rid of any protests or strikes, the government may choose to do a reprisal in up to 2 spaces with government control. That will allow the player to move 1 activist or guerrilla to an adjacent space, remove that protest or strike marker, and if there's any activists still in that space, they'll flip inactive, and place a terror marker there. As mentioned, set the space to neutral, so this could happen in a space already at neutral or even at support. That's probably a last-ditch activity if things are that bad. This activity can only be paired with roundup or assault. So combined with those operations, I tend to think of this as a nuclear option. And finally, government may seek to shift a space towards support and boost their aid level. They can do that with a charm special activity. In just 1 space with government control, by spending 1 patronage, they can shift that space towards support and also gain 3 aid. This can also be paired with a train or sweep operations. Reformers can gain resources during the regular course of play by performing an appeal special activity. This just requires removal of their activists in spaces without protest, and for each activist removed, the reformer earns 2 resources. This can be paired with any operation. There's no limit on the number of activists or spaces this can be done in, just as long as they're not at protest. Reformers can get more activists on the board by using Convert. In a maximum of 2 spaces with active activists, thus the protest spaces, and government pieces, remove 2 government cubes or exchange 1 cube for 1 activist. Or if there's only a government base, replace that with a reformer base. Reduce the government's patronage by 1 for each space, or 2 if a base is exchanged. This activity can be paired with recruit, persuade, and protest operations, just not assemble. And in one space with activists and terror, reformers can canvass to remove the terror and set the space automatically to opposition. Again, that's set the space, not shift. Straight to opposition, no matter what state it's in. This activity can be paired with just canvass or persuade. The MPA faction's method of gaining resources is extort. In any spaces without government control, activate one underground guerrilla and collect one resource. Pair that with rally, march, or terror, just not attack. The MPA may strike to shift a space to resistance and remove protests and even activists. In a maximum of 2 spaces with underground guerrillas and no terror marker present, place a strike token, or if there's a protest there, flip it to strike, and flip any activists there to inactive. If desired, remove one activist and shift the space towards resistance. Remember that there's just 4 protest strike markers for the whole game, so this is a way to get a strike out there if they're already taken and there's some protest on the board. This can only be paired with march. And to ensure an attack operation success or to execute a sneak attack, the MPA may execute an ambush special activity. This ensures the attack's success without having to roll a die, but it does require one underground guerrilla that gets activated. However, it will also place a new underground guerrilla. This can be paired with march or attack. Now that we understand the pieces, the map, and what the pieces can do on the map, let's take a look at how the game is played. There's a standard scenario and an extended scenario is outlined in the rulebook. I'll focus on the extended scenario. First, set up the pieces on the board as indicated in the last few pages of the rulebook. Be sure to place the guerrilla pieces as inactive. Place the patronage marker at 1 for the government. And now, to make sure you've got a firm grasp of the scoring, try to set the score markers by just looking at the illustration before looking at the victory track markers. Do you know what the starting score is? If you guessed 14 for the Gov, 1 for the MPA, and 0 for the Reformers, you are correct. Government controls 13 points worth of population and has a patronage of 1 for a total score of 14. NPA has just 1 base on the map but no resistance. Reformers have no bases and no opposition on the board, so they start off on the back foot. In fact, they don't even have any pieces on the board to start. So, hint, hint, that faction will probably be doing some recruiting very early on. But first, let's mark the rest of the items on the track. Government aid is set to 10 at the start of the game, and for the resources, mark those with the round cylinders for each faction. Government starts with 12, NPA and Reformers both start with 6. Take the other cylinders and place them on the sequence of play box, symbol side up in the eligible factions box. All the other pieces belonging to the players are placed on the player mats in front of them. But before doing that, have a look at the back of these mats. There's an excellent summary of what these factions are all about, so it's a smart idea to check these out if this is your first time playing. Now, set up the event deck. Take the election cards and set them aside, then shuffle all the event cards together. Since we're setting up for the extended scenario, make 3 piles of 10 cards each. Now take 4 out of each pile. Place the Nino Aquino murdered card in one of the piles of 4, 1984 election in the next pile, 1986 election in the final pile of 4. Shuffle those cards in with the other 4 you place them with, keeping track of which one is where. Those will form the bottom 5 cards in each pile, so take the other 6 cards that you separated out in each one, stack them so that the 1986 election is on the bottom, 1984 election stack is in the middle, the Nino Aquino murdered stack on the top. Place the 1981 election card in the election box on the board and note the effect it has on the government enrich special activity for this round. As you'll be drawing cards from the events deck, the next election card will eventually be revealed and will replace this one in its lingering effect. But for now, 1981 election is in full effect. The events deck is now set up. So reveal the top card and place it next to the event deck. Now, in some other coin games, you'll actually reveal the next card so players can plan accordingly. In People Power, you only get to see 1 card at a time. If you're playing with the personality cards and you're playing the standard scenario, players can select those now. For the extended scenario, this won't happen until after the next campaign election round. Also, if this is your first time ever playing the game, you might want to skip this step until you get more familiar with it. Add the complexity later on. Turning our attention now to the sequence of play box, this dictates the flow and which faction gets to do what in which order. As all factions begin as eligible, the first player of the game is the faction noted in the leftmost space. showing the sequence of faction symbols on the top of the event card. It'd be government, NPA, and reformers. The first player has these options: operation and special activity. This player will get to execute as many of the same operation in different spaces as allowed by the operation that they can afford. They also get to pair that operation with one of the special activities as stipulated in the max spaces on their player aid. Reminder that some special activities can only be executed with certain operations. Event or operation only means the player may choose to trigger the event as listed on the card, or perform an operation in multiple spaces but not with any special activity paired. Whichever of these two options the first player chooses, the second player will get to choose the opposite. So if the first eligible chooses operation special activity, the second eligible may choose the event or ops only, and vice versa. Players will want to pay close attention to the event's text when making the decisions. The top of the text tends to favor the government, the bottom the other two insurgent factions. So even if the event isn't favorable for your faction, you may want to take it or select op only so that the second eligible doesn't take the powerful event. In either case, if the player chooses one of the boxes to the right, they'll be ineligible to act on the next card. But there's actually two other options. Limited operation, aka lim op, is one of the faction's operations in only one space with no special activity. Or pass to gain 1 resource if you're playing as NPA or Reformer, 3 resources if you're playing Government. In either case, choosing these two options means the player will stay eligible to act on the next card. And if they're the only player eligible next turn, they'll be the only one acting on the card. So let's look at the first few cards in this deck that's been set up to see how this plays out. First card, Caesar Climaco Assassinated, shows the Reformers as first eligible, NPA as second, and Government as third. Reformer gets to choose first, and they like the look of that event. Free recruit in 3 spaces so it don't cost them any resources, of which they only have 6 to start the game. Not bad. Since removing their pieces in the appeal special activity will net them more resources, so why not? So they choose the event, and get 3 of their pieces on the board at no cost. Now, NPA may act, and they may want to rally some pieces onto the board, but they may want to bide their time and save resources, so they'll do that just in one space, which is a limited op. They'll rally in Central Mindanao. Since there's a base there, they'll get 2 pieces for just 1 resource. And since it's a limited op, they can choose the remaining eligible box above the eligible box, so they'll get to act on the next card as well. Government now has the ability to select operation plus special activity since that space is still free. They're going to take the same pragmatic approach as the NPA did and just train in one space to get 4 cubes on the board for 2 resources. So that's the limited operation as well. They'll get to take that same box as the NPA did, which, by the way, multiple players can take that and multiple players can pass if they want to. Note that just the remain eligible boxes, that's lim op or pass to collect resources, those are the only spaces that can be occupied by more than one faction when selecting them. Since all factions have acted now, it's time to adjust eligibility and reveal the next card. Slide the Reformer piece to the ineligible box since they took the event, Government and NPA back to the eligible box. Next card is Makati Business Club, with Government first eligible, and if Reformers were still eligible, they'd get to act second. But since they're not, NPA will get to act second. Now the Government really likes this event, adding lots of resources early in the game while so many spaces are at support, so they'll take that one. NPA can now do the operation plus special activity, or lim op or pass. This time they elect to do operation and special activity, which will be more rally. So they can also do some extort, which is then flipping those guerrillas that have been placed to active and collecting more resources for a future turn. Each faction took one of the boxes to the right, so now they're both ineligible on the next card, and Reformers will be the only ones eligible on that card, so they'll have free reign. The next card is Moro Pirates, which would normally have them second eligible, but since they're the only ones acting, they can do whatever. The event isn't optimal for them. It's ideal for the NBA if they had that pieces in those spaces, so they wouldn't be taking the event. But they can do ops and special activities, or just ops in multiple spaces, or lim op, or pass. The world is their oyster this turn. Play continues on like this until the next election card is revealed. When that election card is revealed, go through the steps on the back of the player aid before resetting a few things and progressing. First off, reduce patronage by 1 for every strike on the board. Then comes a victory check. Did any of the players reach their victory threshold? If so, congrats to them. If there's multiple players that reach the threshold, whoever overachieved the most is the winner. But otherwise, carry on. Note that there's a few steps about the final round. I'll cover those shortly. Anyway, proceed to the resources phase. Government gets resources equal to the aid level plus all the population that is government controlled. Aid is then reset to 5 on the track. Reformers get resources equal to the population at opposition, and NPA gets resources equal to twice the number of their bases on the map. Next is the support phase. Government player may perform civic action in spaces that have government control, troops, and police, just like in the train operation. Every 2 resources spent removes terror, protest, or strike, then shifts towards support. This can be done in multiple spaces. The NPA may then do agitation, so that's shifting resistance in any space that has NPA control. So 1 resource first removes terror or protest, and each resource after that shifts to resistance, again in multiple spaces. After this, the reformers may place one of their bases anywhere on the map that isn't at government control. Next step is the redeploy, where government may move troops to government-controlled spaces, then they must move troops to either Manila, cities with government control, or spaces with government bases. The newsmaker phase only takes place if you're using the personalities or the acts of desperation cards. Each player will discard their existing personality card, then select a new one, and all reveal at the same time. Or if you're playing the extended scenario and this is the first election, you'll finally now get to select your first personality for the game. Note the effects of the election card that was just revealed before making that decision, because they may be useful or counterproductive towards one of your personalities. If using acts of desperation and the election card that was recently revealed is the 1984 election, meaning there's just 1 round left, then now is the time to secretly select and reveal that card as well. And now we reset, which happens whether you're using those extra cards or not. All factions will now be set to eligible in the sequence of play. All terror, strike, and protest are removed from the board, and all activists and guerrillas are flipped to their inactive side. Place the election card in the box on the board, flip the next card from the event deck, and proceed with play. Once the 1986 election card is revealed, if you make it that far, that will be the final victory check, and you'll execute only in the first few steps of the election round under the victory ? Patronage is still reduced per strike on the board, and if you're using acts of desperation cards, resolve those effects now, starting with the player who has the lowest margin to victory. Once that's done, check the victory track and see who's won. If there's a tie, the winning hierarchy is reformers, then NPA, and then government doesn't win if there's a tie. And that, folks, is people power.